We start now the shift for discussion, and the first one to intervene is Monsignor Sanchez Orondo.
Congratulations. Also, last year was fantastic, and this year also. Very, for me, it's very central, your questions. And my question is this. We can say the singularity of the different religions. All religions have some aspiration universal, we can say. But all religions have his singularities. But in the case of the Christian religion, some of the singularities, for many reasons, but for the idea of the creation, for the idea of Imago Dei, for the idea of the incarnation of Christ, in the end, put the question of the human dignity, as you say, and the question of freedom, and the question of peace, and the question of responsibility, all these notions that are in relation with the freedom and human dignity, peace, we can say. So, it's possible that the other religions work together with the Christian religion to defend the human dignity, to defend freedom, to defend peace against to violence and these other things, that the violence against especially Christianity and these other things, and especially to these new forms of slaves and human trafficking and these things.
I think that's the most central area of research right now. And it's happening at the theological level. Islamic scholars are working out the grounds for seeds of freedom within Islam to oppose the theocrats who wish to impose a single idea of what it means to be a good Muslim or a good Muslim society. But it's also happening at the empirical level. And I guess my own hope is that as the power of these empirical relationships are such that it provides a guidance. If you want a more vibrant, economically viable, peaceful society, you cannot repress this anthropological, this sense of following the dictates of conscience, of following your route to the divine. You cannot impose a single model. And so I think there is a lot of very interesting work going, collaborative work among religious scholars, but also among political scientists and sociologists and historians and others who are looking at ways of developing these relationships. And it's interesting that Daniel Philpott, who is probably the most singular scholar who has documented the Catholic wave of democratization, the way in which the transformation of the Catholic thinking about religious freedom and dignitatis humanae actually served as the engine that helped to fuel the transformation of Catholic majority countries into virtually all democracies. He's now turned his attention to looking at seeds for freedom in Islam. It's challenging. The laws against apostasy and blasphemy, as a number of Muslim scholars are arguing, are tremendously problematic. But I think I argue that the crucible of the 21st century is living with our differences in a shrinking world. And one way or another, religious people are going to have to figure out a way of living together with each other, because that's the only hope for a peaceful kind of society.
Thank you. Jane Mallari, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. This is so interesting because there is so much data here that gives us some real basis for drawing conclusions. I was very interested in, well, as you were talking, I updated a newspaper article about the Pope's visit to Egypt, putting in the Pew data and so on. So I have to ask you about
Egypt is not.
No, but I mean the statistical significance of religious freedom having been tested by such methods means that it's more than just a correlation. Anyway, my question is more on the graph you showed where persecution of Christians is really in the Middle East and North Africa. Can you say something more about that in more detail? Is there a common cause, or is this, in a way, how hopeful can one be that it's possible to address this and get improvement?
It is fascinating to look at the patterns of Christianity around the world. Christianity is growing dramatically in China. Fenggang Yang at Purdue has a team of researchers going throughout China, and he claims that it's unstoppable. It's sort of at the level the Roman Empire was, 5% of the population, and then 50 years later it was 50%. He thinks that's possible in China. The Middle East, it is dramatically shrinking. We are looking at a situation where Christianity can vanish from some Middle Eastern societies. And it's happening because of a combination of the collapse of, you might say, the pressures from theocrats, the pressures from militant Islamists or jihadist groups, and governments that lack the capacity or accede to those forces. So there's governments that repress religious practice. It's difficult for Coptic Christians to even repair a church. It's hard to get a permit. So governments make it difficult for Christians to practice. And then when you have the civil wars, the religious civil wars, then it is a targeted strategy of ISIS to assault the Christian community. Because if you can assault the Christian community and expel it, then it's much easier to deal with Muslims who reject your ideology. In other words, it's a strategy of intimidation to other civil society actors. So if you're a Yazidi or a Baha'i or an Ahmadi, your fate is tied to the Christian minority. But it's not as grim in Egypt, because there's a large Coptic population, as it is in Syria and Iraq, where civil war is devastating to the community. And one of the chapters in the Christianity and Freedom volumes by Matt Barber on Christianity in Iraq and Syria contends that it is a logical strategy either for the people to flee or to form self-defense forces. So in some cases, Christians are developing militias in Syria and Iraq to work with Kurds to actually try to defend enclaves. And he makes the case that that the international community ought to try to protect the Yazidi and Christian minorities in order to preserve the pluralist fabric of these societies, because the jihadist groups would like to end the pluralism of these societies, which would be bad for women, bad for Muslim reformers, and other religious minorities.
Thank you. Now, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ellen, this is fantastic. I have two quick observations and one question. One observation is that I assume you probably know about the Varieties of Democracy database, which has now gone online through our institute, and I think that'd be a great way to test a lot of these propositions against a whole new set of data in very interesting ways, and I would imagine you'll find a lot of confirmation there. Secondly, it strikes me that one of the reasons this is so important is precisely because in so much of the scholarly and policy world relating to democracy and development, there are just deaf ears here. People don't want to hear this. You probably know a lot of the story that I know about how, for example, a lot of the studies here that you cite by Bob Woodbury for years wouldn't get published in the political science world. I mean, it was just, they were unwilling to see it go to print. Bruce Weidick, an economist at San Francisco, has done some similar work similar to Rebecca Shaw's on the relationship between religious empowerment and economic development among women. His work has been in Central America, but when he presented it at the World Bank, the response of the World Bank official said, wow, these are really great results. How can we get them without religion? Right? Or actually, to quote literally, she said, how can we eliminate the ick factor, right? The distaste for religion in this, right? So the question there, to the extent there is one, is simply, what can we do to make this, in some senses, a little bit more mainstream, since the data is so overwhelming in support of it? Third, and I guess a more substantive question, not just strategic one, is this. In the paper, you, as far as I can tell, you are equating religious freedom and religious agency. And I wonder about that a little bit, because I don't think those are exactly the same thing. And even you, at one point in your slides, you were describing religious freedom in terms of things like exit and voice and choice and social freedom, sort of these external factors. Then later you described agency in terms of things like hope, self-respect, these sort of internal dimensions of agency. And so the question really is, how do those things go together? They, to use sort of a conceptual framework from someone like Amartya Sen, it seems that the first category are what he would call capacities, and the second category are what he would call functionings. I mean, capacities that are actually realized through an internal state that puts the human person in motion, so to speak. And so how exactly are you thinking of the relationship between freedom and agency, their difference, and how they're related to one another in this?
I think, first of all, Paolo, I think that's the critical theoretical clarification and work I have to do. Because in reading Rebecca Shaw's work and some others, I was struck by that internal sense of agency, the sense of spiritual capital, the sense of hope, dignity, the sense of a transcendent source of one's self-regard. On the other hand, I think the freedom to act on your religious beliefs, the freedom to operate in religious communities, seems to serve agency. So I need to do more work on, because I do think they're connected. There's no question in my mind that you cannot exercise religious agency well in a society that has apostasy and blasphemy laws that are imposed relentlessly on civil society actors. It's difficult. So there's a relationship between the ability of that internal agency and the lack of external restraints. And actually, I'd appreciate some conversation on how to develop that. But I saw the connection as I looked at the research on, violence, the locus effect, and so forth, and the capacity of people to operate. How to go mainstream, I think that's sort of what I see, in a sense, my role being, or my calling. I hope to write a major piece like this for some popular magazine, making the case to liberals why they should care about religious freedom again, in the sense that it is a liberal idea, but there's a sense in which it's become kind of a conservative cause, and I think it's terrible for those of us who believe in the grand liberal experiment, you might say. With respect to how to the religious empowerment, the kind of research that Rebecca Shaw does, this is amazing to me. So Rebecca Shaw and Bob Woodbury, whom Paolo mentioned, have teamed up and have gotten, I think, $1.5 million, $2 million grant from the Templeton Trust. They're actually going to conduct a natural experiment, an actual experiment. So they're going to look at 9,000 women in Sri Lanka and India who are involved in microenterprise and so forth, and they're actually going to control for evangelization, if you can believe it. This wouldn't get through my institutional review board, but this is the kind of thing that they're going to be able to do. In other words, they're going to actually go into places where religious missionary activity is allowed and places where it's not. so they can actually look at the impact of people making a religious transformation, having a conversionary experience, so they can literally measure how that conversion experience impacts their economic, social uplift and empowerment. And they're actually using donations for that part of their research. They're not using, so I think it's fascinating, and it's a huge problem, getting the academic, sort of the secular academic community to actually look at the data. Robert Woodbury documented that Protestant missionary activity explained half of all of the variation in democracy in a number of countries where they operated, and actually produced economic benefits 2 generations past the time when the missionaries operated. And it went through more vetting at the American Political Science Review than any other article, I think, probably in history. So ultimately, I think the research will win out.
Thank you. At this moment, with 3 discussions, we have consumed 1/2 of the time for discussion. In the list, I still have 5 more. That means I need back your discussions and the speaker to concentrate questions and answers. Reverend JC.
As I am coming from India, I can tell that really religious freedom in the past in India has helped, and I have witnessed also for the economic upliftment, promotion of literacy, gender equality. And also I can add that for the development of the native cultures and languages, I can add that also. I have examples for that. Then, now my question is, we are happy that in the recent past there has been importance for religion. Now, simultaneously, especially in India, there has been a tremendous growth in religious fundamentalism. So what is the problem here? Why, when there is an importance for religion, religious agency, there is also an increase of religious fundamentalism? If it is the case also in Europe and in the whole world, how to face it?
Thank you for that question. It is the result of the absence of the protections of religious freedom and agency that is leading to the empowering of the Hindu nationalists. We are speaking of the fundamentalists that are renascent in a number of states, and of course India as a whole. And what happens is this: where Hindu nationalists have succeeded in getting certain states to pass anti-conversion laws, then they can use the pretext, the rumor that some Christians were forcibly converting Hindus to Christianity, as a pretext for a massive orchestrated mob violence on communities, with destruction of property and injuries and killings and so forth. And a lot of times in those states, the state authorities just look away. They can do this with impunity. So there's an interaction between the dominant social actors, the Hindu nationalists, and the government, which just looks the other way at mob violence. And that has a devastating impact on the Dalits, Christians, Muslims, and tribal people that are trying to break out of the straitjackets of their cultural society. And so it is not actually the religious freedom that's leading to the fundamentalism. It's actually the restrictions on religion that are empowering the religious fundamentalists who want to impose a single vision on Indian society, that it must be Hindu. And we see the same thing in other societies.
Louis Savoie.
Monsieur le Président. Alors, je remercie notre ami conférencier pour ce brillant tableau qu'il a brossé en soulevant les principales facettes de la question. Je vais me concentrer sur un aspect très précis. À un moment, vous parlez des conflits et de l'influence de la religion. Vous donnez même des statistiques à l'effet que 19% des conflits étaient d'origine religieuse en 1950 et qu'il y en aurait 50% maintenant. J'aimerais avoir quelques statistiques sur les pays. Enfin, nous savons tous que la ligne à préciser entre un conflit typiquement religieux avec des origines politiques, ethniques, linguistiques est difficile à tracer. Moi, je pense par exemple au conflit qui a duré très longtemps en Irlande, au conflit en Bosnie, et je pourrais vous donner beaucoup d'exemples. Mais très souvent, c'est un phénomène politique aussi qui amène des tensions religieuses. En 1947, on a eu le plus grand transfert de population du 20e siècle avec 13 millions de gens qui sont sortis de l'Inde, des musulmans pour aller au Pakistan, et des hindouistes ou des hindous qui sont allés au Pakistan. Donc, je pourrais vous donner beaucoup d'exemples aujourd'hui. Le Boko Haram en Afrique, qui n'est pas d'origine strictement religieuse, mais s'en donne. La plupart des conflits en Afrique aujourd'hui ont des influences politiques, idéologiques, parfois ethniques et parfois religieuses. Donc, la ligne est difficile à tracer.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Alan. I think that what is impossible will never happen. That means, why not we make some other questions and you
That'll
have
summarize.
a global answer. Stefano Giovanni.
Thank you, Alan, for your very inspiring paper. I have a very quick question, as always I do. What I would be interested in knowing your opinion on the work carried on by that group of both economists and sociologists in the United States, headed by Yannaccone. They have Yannaccone is professor of economic sociology or something like that, on the so-called marketplace of religion. Their argument is the following. So that is why I want to know they said, since religious freedom is a pillar of a market economy, and since all the countries, at least formally, accepted the market economy model, then we should, at the international level, require them to, and so they are proposing to insert religious freedom as a precondition to be admitted to WTO, the World Trade Organization. What do you think about such a proposal, which is perhaps typical of the American milieu, but perhaps it has a point? Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Vittorio Hosle, please brief.
Yeah, two facets of the question. If we try to understand why there is no religious freedom, two factors come to my mind, and I would like to see how you evaluate them. The one is, of course, religious fanaticism. And in this sense, the classical liberals are right that religion can be an impediment to religious freedom because you want all people to agree with your own idea. There is even the theory that monotheism is particularly fanatic and illiberal, as Christianity was in the Middle Ages and early modernity, but India shows us that this is not limited to it. The second reason are traumatic experiences by secular states with religions that have tried to get political power, and that's the main reason for China. You're completely right, in China Christianity is on the rise. It is unbelievable with which vitality it develops. I myself have witnessed it. If you try to understand why the Chinese government fights against Christianity, you have to mention two things. The Tianping movement in the 19th century, the Taiping movement in the 19th century, and the revolt of the Hui Muslims in the second half of the 19th century. These were traumatic experiences. They led to the deaths of 2-digit million Chinese. And so how can you convince secular governments that religious freedom will not lead to civil war?
Yeah. Let me see if I can take those
Now,
questions.
last but not the least,
Oh, okay.
Monsignor
Okay,
Minerat.
Monsieur.
No, very short. Would you consider that the prohibition of the burqa in the public square is religious persecution or is it defense of public order? The burqa, the prohibition of the burqa, of the Islamic veil, total veil, you know, is it religious persecution or is it defense of the public order?
Okay. You know, I think that there's a difference, and this is what's interesting, Monsignor, between the hijab, which my Muslim students wear, and they say it's a symbol of their fidelity to God, in the same way a Sikh would say, you know, his turban is a symbol of his, and the burqa. So I think you can argue the burqa is a consideration of public order. It is a restriction. And by the way, Grimm, the Pew Research Center, says some restrictions may make sense. They don't make a normative evaluation on, you know, there are certain restrictions that maybe make sense. So just to the answer, I think that could be a matter of public order, but it is also a restriction. But some restrictions may make sense. It's not persecution. There's a difference between a restriction or discrimination and persecution. Persecution involves more violence. With respect to the Civil War, I think you're right. Absolutely. There are lots of civil wars that have political or ethnic or tribal or dimensions. And the civil war in South Sudan that I've studied is not religion-based. It's tribal-based. It's tragic, heartrending. But I think what Toff, Philpott, and Shaw argue in God's Century is that however you define the number of religious civil wars has increased as a percent of all civil wars. And they're more difficult, they're more intractable, they're often more lethal. And they are related to the effort by one side or another, in a sense, to impose its religious uniformity on the whole of society. Getting to your point, Victoria, fanaticism, in fact, is strongly correlated with efforts by states or dominant social groups to enforce religious uniformity. So you tend to get what Philpott and Shaw and Toff call militant theologies. You tend to get militant theologies where religious actors are prevented from operating in civil society. And so it is understandable. I mean, the Chinese, understandably, are terrified of fanatical religious movements that destabilize society. And that's why, in a sense, the Christian community there has been very strategic in quietly saying to the Chinese authorities, look, we're ideal citizens. We're law-abiding. We are charitable. We respond to disasters. And try to provide an opportunity for us to operate in civil society, and we will be loyal, patriotic citizens. So that's their pitch to the Chinese. We're not the Taiping Rebellion. We're not a cult, a fanatical cult. But the evidence seems to, and this is where I think the message to sort of secular governments and classical liberals is that if you fear religious fanaticism, the engine of it right now is coming out of societies where either the government is ramping up its effort to compete with the theocrats. In other words, the Saudis have to be even more militant in their theology to compete with those who would overthrow it and make it even more Sharia-based and so forth. So the militant theologies, the fanaticism tends to rise out of socially or politically, religiously repressive environments. In some cases, they're secular repressive. Dan Philpott notes that a number of the Muslim-majority countries, especially in Central Asia, have secular repressive governments that attempt to repress Muslim civil society activity. The WTC, the criteria, asking about the criteria, I don't think that makes sense, is actually to impose a criteria. And as to the religious marketplace idea, I find the sociologists who use the analogy of the free marketplace of religion valuable as an analytical tool. I wouldn't take it too far at the global level to link it with the free marketplace of economics. But Grimm and Brian Grimm and the Business and Religious Freedom Foundation does show that there is a strong link between a tolerant, religiously pluralistic and tolerant society and vibrant entrepreneurial activity and so forth.